know, earth or right like on top of the earth, right? And then once your feet are flat, imagine your feet or, you know, the bottom of your chair, your arm crutches, whatever your abilities are, connecting to the earth beneath you. Imagine that there's little roots or whatever works for you, little vibrations, colors, whatever it is. Imagine yourself joining to the earth, and imagine that there's roots or energy lines going right out to the earth underneath wherever you're sitting, and connecting with the trees and the grasses and all of the items in the natural world and those ecosystems. And just plant yourself. Breathe deeply in through the mouth and out through the nose, and just remember that you are a part of everything. That we are, yes, big brained, or so we like to think, and we get up here a lot. But let's remember to connect down to the earth, into the water underneath the earth, the fire in the middle of the earth. So all of those elements. And take a deep breath, take that air, that life-giving air in. Hopefully you should feel grounded. And if you want, or you can, bring your arms out, stretch like this, and then bring it back to your heart meridian is what I call it. And you can do that a couple times if you want. Bring them out, bring them in. Notice your breath, take a deep breath, and get any, like, you know, this stuff when you're sitting, especially if you're working on a desktop, laptop, get all that neck stuff, crick yourself over. Sometimes I crack, so if it comes over the mic, sorry. And, you know, move your head to each side as well. Ooh, and I'm starting to feel it. You should start feeling a little tingly because the blood's going to start moving. Because I've been working all morning too. Got some deadlines this week, and you know, then the last step would be to move your core as well. So without moving your bum, move as far as you can using your rib cage, and really move your torso, right? Oh, I'm so tight. I don't know, maybe some of you are looser, but and okay, I lied. I said that was the last thing. If you can, also move forward in your chair and just stretch out your lower back a little bit. And you can help yourself do that also by going back and forth with your shoulders like this, right? Just very slowly. There you go. And now I'm ready for bed. So that's our movement. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm telling you to do things as the first time we meet. So I guess that's okay. And let me apologize before we go any farther and I even introduce myself and all that stuff. We've got a little bit of local smoke today from the BC forest fires, so I am very scratchy. I will try not to do that too often on the mic. If I, at any time today, I might have to, I hope I don't, just click on mute for a second and cough it out and then come back to you. I'm going to do that to save your ears. But I'm a bit scratchy, so I apologize in advance. Okay, so I didn't know we were calling for smoke today, so I left my windows open all night and I woke up very scratchy, you know. So I should introduce myself properly and tell you why Manisha invited me here and all that stuff, and you know, all of that. So I'll start by saying Tanse, Suzanne Methot. I am Nehio Squale. It means Cree woman, if you don't know. I was born in Vancouver, but I grew up in Peace River, which is also known as Sagatawa. Some of you may also know that. Sagatawa being, you know, a very ancient gathering place for a lot of First Nations in that area. It was shared territory, and that's where, you know, Alexander Mackenzie came up, 1792, and made contact with the Dunza and the Cree from the east and the Cree from the south, which is where my mom is from. My mom is Rocky Mountain Cree. That's sort of the northernmost territory of Rocky Mountain Cree territory, would be the rivers around Sagatawa. So it was shared territory and a very strong gathering place, and Mackenzie could feel that. So boop goes the settler town right on top of the ancient Indigenous site. So I was very lucky to grow up in Peace River. I'm Bear Clan. I'm also proudly Scottish. Insofar as a person in Scotland would actually consider any of the Scottish diaspora Scottish at this point, I don't know. My white people have been in the Americas since 1648. So are we Scottish? Well, I don't know. Maybe I'd have to talk to a Scottish person about that, but I'm sure they'd welcome me. And we were very much raised Scottish. I was racialized as a kid, and before I ever knew that word, right? I would notice, well, why are they putting me over here with these guys, right? And why are they treating me? Why do they call me certain words? I knew that what the words were, you know, S word and other words, and I knew that I was being treated differently. So I would go home, and I was the one in the family who would say, "Yeah, Mom, are we Native?" So I come from that kind of a family, and there's many of us out there, unfortunately, where neither of my parents knew who they were or what their histories were beyond some of the most talked about settler sort of narratives, right? And I'm glad to know my Scottish side. There is a very long history there, but neither of my parents knew anything about the Indigenous sides of the family. So for me, and this is why Manisha has invited me here today to share some time with you, is it's been a lifelong journey for me, what I would call cultural reclamation, and trying to determine, you know, who am I? And yes, that's normal. We all do that, of course. We all change and grow and develop. But in a colonial place like Canada, it was quite the journey, and so I'm going to be sharing a little bit about that with you today. I also want to say, before I go any farther, and in case I forget, that that journey of cultural reclamation has also happened with a lot of help from community, and I really always want to start with that, because you know, I would be nothing and no one without community, right? Community has, you know, been my place of first and always really finding belonging and a sense of identity. But I'm very happy to be here with you today and to talk a little bit more about that. So I'll just go into it, because Manisha has given me, she provided me with like a series of 10 questions that she wanted me to address for you all, to talk about these issues. Now, I've got my newest book, is Killing the Witigo. I've got that with me. I should probably, excuse my turning around, also get the book that came out in 2019, Legacy. Just in case we have time, I might share a few things from the new book with you, because it relates so much about culture and youth being becoming more comfortable with knowing some cultural ideas. Yeah, so hopefully we will get there. So one of the first questions that Manisha wanted me to address was, you know, when I was a child, you know, when were you exposed to cultural practices? And I have to sort of frame my answer to that in a couple of different ways, right? Because we all have different settings, right? Different microcosms, different macrocosms. I mean, if you're talking about school, the answer was never, okay? I was born in '68. I went to school in the '70s and the '80s, post-secondary late '80s. Then I went back for a postgraduate degree in the mid-aughts, right? So in school, you know, in terms of being a kid and an undergraduate student in the '80s, it was never, absolutely nothing. There was, and I wrote about that in Legacy, about, you know, there being thousands and thousands of years of Indigenous history in Sagadawa. And I remember in, was it '75? no, when was it? 80? Yeah, where's my edition at? Correct me if I'm wrong, sometime around early 80s, I guess, where it was the 75th anniversary of Alberta's creation as a province. And we were all given a little medal, and we were all, and that's what we were taught in school. That was very much what it was like growing up in Canada until very recently. And I think in some places that still happens, given the stories I hear. But in the surrounding community in the piece, I would have to say that it was sometimes, right? Because we did have the Sagatawa Friendship Center right there in Peace River. I think it's still around, last time I checked. And you know, there was a youth group. We used to go down to the basement there and put on records. God, I feel so old talking sometimes because it's like everything that we don't do anymore, right? And you know, there was a kitchen there, a popcorn maker. But when we talk about culture, it was a lot of like the material aspects of culture, right? So it was like the moccasins, moose-hide moccasins with the beadwork that, you know, someone out at Little Buffalo or up at Cadott had made, right? There was never any sort of like direct sort of connection or like led activities or anything. You know, not that I experienced any anyway. So it was a lot of material culture. And in terms of like extracurricular activities, the things that I did on my own, because, you know, I was interested in band and, you know, different, you know, clubs and whatever, and I was in like school sports and stuff, right? I would also have to say, absolutely never. There was never a time in band, for instance, where you know, we played a song based on like an E. Pauline Johnson poem or, you know, anything like that. It was just never, never, never. And I don't think any of you would be surprised at that. Canada has changed a lot, even since I hit, I guess, what we could say adulthood. I think I'm there. You know, since the resistance at Kanesatake. I mean, I think since Oka, 1990, Canada has changed a lot. And I've seen those changes because this has been my adult life, right? So over the last like almost 30 years now, yes, there has been a lot of change. And I think a lot of schools are making a big effort to not have that be the case for kids today. But then, as we're going to discuss, you know, how do we bridge those gaps with children and youth? So we will get there. Manisha also wanted to talk about, like, when we talk about cultural practices, you know, what does that mean for you? Like, what type of cultural practice? So I would have to say first, I wanted, when I was thinking and writing down some jot notes for this, I thought to myself first, I mean, I was trained as a social historian. And as an educator, human development is kind of my thing, right? Humans, they're endlessly fascinating. And cultures. So humans and the societies they create, cultures, that's kind of my nerdy thing. And so I want to start by saying that, you know, we often think of culture when it refers to Indigenous peoples as the ritual stuff, the fancy stuff, the performative stuff often. But I just want to make sure that we all remember that culture is everything, right? Exclamation points. In education, we often say that the curriculum is everything too, right? Because it's not just what we're studying in school, it's what happens at lunch, right? It's what happens in the lunchroom between, you know, the lunch ladies and the kiddos, or on the schoolyard, or, you know, and it's what happens at home, because on Monday morning, when kids come back to my classroom and they say they've had a hard weekend and they only had one meal, well, guess what? That's the culture that they're growing up in. And it might be a negative aspect of culture, or it might be, you know, part of being marginalized as an Indigenous person, but that's culture for them, and what we tend to normalize and stuff. So it's, I want us to get beyond when we talk about culture, but beyond the fancy performative stuff, and also the negatives as well. And just to remember that culture is everything, but it can include the negatives as well. So for me, given that undergraduate school, like I had, contact with other Indigenous people at my undergraduate at uni, but there were, back then in the late 80s, there were no Indigenous Students Association, like nothing. So we kind of connected, and then we would kind of, kind of float away. There was nothing to sort of bring us together, right? So it was when I was 21, 22, I moved to Toronto, and I thought I was going to move there for a year, take a course at Ryerson, as it used to be known. Now it's TMU. And then I don't know where I was going to end up from there. I guess it depends on the job, right? But I didn't get into the program. I thought I wanted to be a journalist. So I didn't get into the 1-year journalism program for degree graduates. The guy told me I should be writing fiction and stuff. And I was like, well, yeah, I want to do that too. But anyway, they rejected me. So I ended up having to like, whoa, what's going on? And so I ended up working for Indigenous-led agencies in advocacy positions that also included some activism. We were creating a lot of culture-based models. And so that's really the type of work that I first connected with as cultural practice. Was when I moved to Toronto, I had community around me, and we were all sort of in the same space of, okay, so we have clients with these needs and these goals, and we have families, with these needs and these goals. Here's what's going on in Toronto and, elsewhere, because, Ipperwash became a thing in the 90s, the death of Dudley George, and there was so many things going on, right? So that was how we sort of all kind of, and yet we were all, people who either didn't know who we were, or some of my colleagues, their parents were residential school survivors or scoop survivors. Some of us were, survivors of the scoop ourselves, right? Not me, but my colleagues. And so it was sort of this space, at least in my experience, where we were all trying to come together and create something based on, well, what we weren't sure, but based on some ancient ideas and philosophies, but to sort of make them into models that we could use with clients, students, families. And so it was a learning for us at the same time as we were running seminars and running, activist camps, and doing all the work that we were doing in a social service sort of environment. And if I'm going to answer that question around what type of cultural practice, I would actually say that, Indigenous cultures value listening, right? And that was actually the biggest cultural practice that I took part in, I guess, or learned about. And that was one of the biggest things that changed my life. Just being seen and heard, and having someone say, tell me. And then them not interrupting and not asking questions, nothing, just, yes, yeah, and just listening. It was transformative. It was life-changing, right? And we'll get to a little bit more. I mean, I didn't have that in my household, right? So that was one of the biggest cultural practices, listening. And then when I think of listening, I also have to bring up, and I wrote about this quite a bit in Legacy. I went to a healing circle at Anishinaabe Health Toronto. It's still around in Toronto. It's a health services agency. I think they've got 3 locations now. At the time, they only had 1. It was a storefront in, kind of a rundown area of the city, all that they could afford at the time. And there was a weekly healing circle every Monday night. The Monday night healing circle was run by a guy from Fort Capel area, actually in Saskatchewan, a pipe carrier. And he was on his healing path. He had done time in prison, a couple of different provinces, and also did work in the prisons. He and his wife, were connected with prisoners, and including Prison for Women. And so he ran the healing circle at AHT. And that was another part of the listening. but also the talking, is starting to narrate your experience, starting to hear from other people like, oh, other people have experienced this. You mean it's not just me? And so I stopped feeling like a freak. I stopped feeling like, well, all these things have happened to me, I must have deserved it somehow. And realizing that, wait a minute, and then putting that together with the work I was doing, right, in the agencies, and thinking, oh, wait, this is because of colonialism, colonization. Oh, and like all the aha moments started to happen at that healing circle, and finding a voice to narrate your experience. I'm a big fan to this day of narrative therapy, because we certainly got it in the healing circle for sure. I went to that healing circle for like 2 years, every single week, right? And so listening to others, and like sometimes it took an hour and a half, depending on who showed up. Sometimes we were there for like 6 hours. Seriously, like it started at, was it 6 or 7? I think it was 6. And sometimes we wouldn't get out of there till like 11 or midnight. It just depended on the day. And so we learned how to take care of each other as well. We learned what it meant to be like a community in that space, right? It was incredibly transformative. And I don't know if there's anywhere that offers healing circles anymore. When I look at some of the agencies, now I'm based in the Gulf Islands, or even Toronto today, I don't even think AHT has a healing circle anymore. So yeah, yes. And Anishinaabe Health Toronto also had funding and staff who were coordinating, visiting elders. They had what I would call like medicine people. Some people like to use the term shaman or healer, where they could do spiritual work with you. They also had herbalists coming down, people who could, prescribe and dispense plant medicine. I received my name. Medicine person found my name for me, my spirit name. The herbalists also, because Indigenous healthcare is very holistic, mind, body, spirit, emotion, there was also a bit of counseling, right? That was sort of part of that appointment, where it wasn't really talk therapy in the Western sense, but where you would tell the person, well, this is what's going on with my body. And then they would ask questions about, well, what's going on mentally, spiritually, right? That's causing this. And so there was a way to sort of narrate and then re-story your experiences, and to also use those plant medicines to really move that energy, and gain not just a sense of wellness, gain wellness and balance again, right? Because I had gone to a lot of Western providers, and tests and tests and tests. There's a whole chapter in Legacy about that, so I won't go into it. In case you want to pick up Legacy, it is in libraries. You don't have to buy it. It's okay. Yeah, and nobody could ever really pinpoint what I was feeling. It was the physical aspects of intergenerational trauma, right? So it was the herbalists and the medicine people at Anishinaabe Health, and that was in the 90s. And there was also programming all around Toronto in those years. Again, I don't know so much about today, but there was always full moon ceremonies at various agencies. There were sweats. You had to sign up, and they would have a van, and there were certain places where, there was land, access to land, and they would have a permanent lodge set up there. There were feasts at different agencies, not just solstice or equinox, but different reasons. I know when I was working at Native Women's Resource Center, that we would have a monthly feast for all the babies that had been born that month, those sorts of things. And there was also times like the Native Canadian Center of Toronto, the Friendship Center, would get a couple of vans, and we would go down to Michigan. There was this elder that did that helped people on their fasts, their 4-day fasts, and then community would come and help bring them out of the fast, right? So to have that feast and to welcome them back after their experience. So it was a pretty transformative time, you guys. Just telling you that. I don't think I've talked about everything that happened all at once ever, or at least for a very long time. And I recognize how incredibly, like, what's the word? I don't want to say lucky. This should be a part of everything we offer, but I feel like I was lucky to access that. But like it was, I feel grateful, I guess, that all of that was available to me. So Manisha's next question was urban or rural? Well, again, both, right? It depends where you are and when you are. I had many friends in Toronto from different communities. But one of the families that, you know, sort of welcomed me under their wing a bit and basically taught me what it meant to be Cree, because I certainly didn't know, was from Saddle Lake, Alberta. So they're from Toronto, they live in Toronto, but always kind of going back and forth. And of course, family's still back at Saddle Lake. So I visited, I watched, I listened. There were a lot of meaningful experiences. When I visited, you know, the matriarch, I guess, Kokum, up at Saddle Lake, a bunch of us from Toronto went to Saddle Lake one summer, you know, and her daughters, the one daughter who lived in Toronto, you know, were guiding us on, this is how we're going to collect medicines from the land. So this is how we're going to pick sweetgrass and sage, and giving us those teachings. And I mean, I knew nothing, absolutely nothing, zero, nada, zilch. So like, but I was really raring to go, right? So it was kind of after dinner, and we we're gonna go out, and it was getting a little dark out, you know, because it was later. And I said, oh, are we gonna go out now? And, you know, Pauline said to me, well, you know, the plants are going to sleep right now, so let's wait until tomorrow. And just to, you know, basic teachings around, you know, it's not always about you, right? It's like, you know, I don't even know if I can explain that very well, but just it'll happen, right? Just let it happen, right? So I remember that, you know, they were prepping some eagle feathers to make a staff, and just watching. And I was given no tasks to do at all because I knew nothing, and that was perfectly fine, as it should have been. But to watch and to learn from that, it was really an honor. And then, you know, somebody's sister lived at Kikino Métis settlement, and so, you know, going there and you know, experiencing community and all the cousins and the children, and you know, I come from a family of, like, I have two half siblings. There's me and like my mother, who was basically a single mother most of the time. And I'm looking at like all these people, right? I'm just like, how big are your families? And realizing that actually that used to be normal for us. And then when I did my genealogy, both sides, you know, realizing that even like my white folks, like when we were back farming, of course we had 10, 11, 12, 15 kids, right? So, you know, urban, rural, we're a little, it was both. It was Saddle Lake, it was driving around different communities where my friends lived in Alberta, Medicine Hat, you know, Saskatoon. And then of course I was living in Toronto, and I had my work and my community there. So, and you know, I want to say too that, you know, culture and cultural reclamation, right, is about learning what to do and also not what not to do, right? Because there were times, because I don't want it to sound like it was always amazing. I mean, it was, it was, but it's a both and universe, right? And there were times when it wasn't so amazing, when what we used to call residential school syndrome, but now we're sort of more or less calling intergenerational trauma, would happen. And, you know, I remember one time I think two sisters, like, I mean, like, you know, from the Catholic Church, right, came over to the house to give someone communion, and I was sort of asked to disappear, right? And I remember thinking, oh, what, I'm not good enough for the, okay. there were times when when I was really confronted with the legacy of colonization and Christianization. And then I started, because I'm a social history nerd, thinking to myself, this has really affected us. And it sounds kind of silly to say that now, but back in like 94 or whatever, it was a new way of thinking, right? Where we were starting to say, how has this affected us and our families? And then I would say, in terms of urban and rural as well, that there was part of what I was learning here, and I was always told, was that it was my responsibility to pass on what I'd learned. And so I learned very early that everything you learn, you're not a teacher, don't mistake that, but that in community we pass things along to one another, and we share that because we teach each other, right? Knowledge is a group resource, right? And I took that very seriously. Yeah. So then the next question that Manisha had for me, she was very well prepared with these questions. What are the challenges you faced growing up as an Indigenous person? Small cough, sorry. I think we probably all know. I don't think I'm any different in this way. These are probably not going to be a surprise to you. I definitely remember some racist comments. I've already said that the S word was applied to me, SQ word, and I was just confused, like, why are you calling me that? Right? I had no idea. There were sometimes some very stereotypical assumptions, especially with some teachers. Some teachers were my saviors, and they saw me, and they saw that I was bright and that I liked school. School was a safe place for me, right? Because it was away from the weirdness of home, right? But a lot of teachers didn't really expect much from me. I remember in was it elementary? Yeah, it was before junior high. There was what I would call, I don't know what I call it. Was it physical abuse? I don't know, not really, but it was like a sort of like bodily trespass, if that makes any sense. Like, I had teachers, two different ones, men at this one school I went to, who liked to grab me by my chin and like yell at me and like right in my face, and like, and just this idea that someone could come and grab you, and their spittle would be flying in your face while they yelled at you, like that was okay, and that somehow I deserved that. I really internalized that. So stuff like that happened. There was, and by the way, I've written some examples from my own and my family's lives and legacy. So I'm totally over, like, I share stuff. I don't overshare, I have boundaries, but just we're all professionals here. So just so you know, we're going to talk about some of the aces now. So, Indigenous women continue to be sexualized in the worst negative ways, with women still complaining in Winnipeg that they can't take a cab, without being asked to pay by what. And that definitely happened to me. There was childhood sexual abuse in my family. So the essay was there, and the intergenerational cycles of trauma. And I didn't know that until probably 10 or 15 years ago, that what both my parents had experienced in their childhoods, of course, they normalized and passed down to me, right? So there was DV, domestic violence, like all the ACEs, incarceration in my father's case, all the ACEs. And I don't think that those are specifically Indigenous, but I think, of course we know that, but I think I would put it in the Indigenous context, because when you're experiencing those things, and like when my mother would report domestic violence to the Mounties in Peace River, there were certain expectations and assumptions, and they would never act on it. Now, that was very 1970s, before it was often, it's just a private matter, ma'am, but also it was because of who she was, that then, oh, well, and they wouldn't help her. So I do locate it as sort of an Indigenous experience as well, even though, of course, everyone can, experience the ACEs. Growing up, I've mentioned this a little bit, I think, I definitely had a lack of parenting because of what my parents had experienced themselves. I was a caretaker kid. I had to learn how to be perfect to please my mother. I had to, take on responsibilities far beyond my years. And I write in Legacy about how that, in a way, I'm sort of grateful for it. It made me incredibly resilient, and it made me incredibly adaptable, and it made me able to get through a lot of stuff in life. Absolutely. It's also pretty horrible to never have a childhood, though. I think we know that, right? So it took me quite a long time in my adult life to rediscover joy and playfulness and, those sorts of things that I sort of didn't experience as a kid. There's, starting with like my mom, because of how she was raised. She was raised on the white side of her family, but her Indigenous, like her father's roots were completely, not discussed. One photo was kept, and I'm grateful for that photo. It's this little Easter egg in my grandmother's photo album. Like, oh, where did that come from? But and there had been some financial privilege in my family up until then, but starting with my mother and always with my father, there was intergenerational poverty as well. So we know what that means, right? The numerous barriers to success that brings, especially educational attainment, because, I found it really difficult to pay for post-secondary education. Student loans for undergraduate, but then I ended up owing them for 17 years after, and with the interest I got charged from the 80s, believe me, I think I borrowed 12 grand, and I ended up having to pay them at one point, like it was 40 something grand, when you added everything up, like ridiculous. And then when I went back for my education degree, I had no way to pay York University. I had a bursary from the ETFO, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, and they gave me this bursary for Indigenous women in education, and I was able to pay my down payment, which was great, register for my courses, and then I had no more money to pay. So poverty, intergenerational poverty, really, really has affected so many Indigenous people from achieving what they want to achieve, especially in terms of education. And we know, I think, the health challenges that come from toxic stress, that kind of, all of these things that we experience, that kind of toxic stress affects our physical bodies, right? So what's the timing like? Yeah, okay, we're all good for time. So one of Manisha's questions was unconscious bias, ? And I thought, well, what does that mean? What is the question? But I took it sort of to mean, like, how has that factored into life experiences, and whether that's education or whether it's at your work or personal life, right? So I like the openness of that, that it wasn't too. So I just thought to myself, well, here's an example. July 1st, here on Gabriola Island, where I live, there was a bunch of people standing in my front yard waving Canadian flags, because I live right on the road where it meets another road. And I was like, okay, number one, I have to get a fence. Number two, like a low fence. I don't want to be cut off. I don't want to cut the energy flow off. But wow, like they know that's my front yard. What are they doing? So I went out, and this is very much part of Indigenous cultures, I thought I'd use humor, right? So I went out and I said, hey, get off my lawn. Right? And they kind of laughed, but they didn't get what I was doing, like at all. Like that I was trying to tell them, hey, I'm not happy with this. They did not get it at all. So things happened, doesn't matter. And they eventually left my lawn because I asked them to. And I told people, that flag means something different to Indigenous peoples. And yes, I have my Scottish side, and welcome to being mixed. It's both and. But as a Nehio person, I just, can you please go somewhere else? Yeah. And then later a neighbor came and apologized to me. And when I said to her, it just confused me that you would be confused as to why, when we were having the conversation, why I had to explain that it meant something different to us, all this stuff, like, have you not been paying attention? But apparently not. And also, when I first moved here in 2019, so the next summer solstice, summer of 20, of course, we were all distancing. That was in the early days of the COVID thing. But I invited my neighbors to my backyard for a solstice gathering, all distanced, all safe outside. And I shared a couple of Cree songs. So I said to my neighbor when she came to apologize, I said, what part of Indigenous Person Canada Day didn't you get? And she kind of looked down and she thought for a minute, and I didn't interrupt. She thought for a minute. And then she said, well, I wasn't sure, like, the extent of that. And I was like, what? Like, what do you mean? Because I really didn't get it. Like, the extent of that, meaning the issue July 1st. But I felt she was saying it about me. Like, the extent of that? What do you mean? So I said, what do you mean by that? And we discussed it. And she wasn't sure what she meant by that, she said. So when I think of unconscious bias, when I take that example and then we kind of parse it out, there's still this idea that Indigenous people all live over there somewhere, right? No, we're 70% plus urban. I don't understand why everybody thinks we live over there somewhere. We're sitting beside you on the subway every morning if you're in a city, or on the city bus. We're your next door neighbors. We shop at the same grocery stores. I do not understand why people think that, like, But I think it comes down to that unconscious bias around the stereotypes about how Indigenous people look, right? Because sure, I'm pretty light-skinned and everything else, and the short hair doesn't help either. See, in the 90s, I grew my hair really long, like down past my butt. I do have photos. And I had the bangs and I wore the long braid, and like, because I wanted to look more Indigenous. But then I got over that because I realized that that's other people. It's not me. I live according to Cree values. I know all of my histories and I celebrate all of my ancestors, but I am Indigenous and I don't care what people think. And Indigenous peoples who live on reserves sometimes have blonde hair or red hair. And maybe, some of you know this, but I think so many people don't know this or don't consider it. And so when I took that comment, well, I wasn't sure the extent of that. So wait, you think I stand in my backyard and sing a Shaker song, but I'm not really Indigenous because I live here as opposed to on a reserve maybe? Or because I'm, have 2 post-secondary degrees maybe? Or because I'm this or that? Like, what do you mean wasn't sure the extent of that? It's this pernicious, I think, sense of our place in Canadian society. And that, I think, creates a lot of unconscious bias around, when you see certain, let's say, antisocial behaviors and you automatically assume, well, that's, something. Well, it's like, well, no, there's lots of us here that you don't see that are doing incredibly pro-social things, right? And contributing to civic society. Not that there's some sort of hierarchy either, because of course our brothers and sisters, who are experiencing trauma and engaging in certain behaviors, that's just their experience right now. Doesn't mean they haven't or won't contribute, of course. And they're contributing by being sacred beings on the planet too. So there's that. But, there's all of these ideas. And so I think that really has factored into it a lot in my own life, is this idea that, oh, you've written books, or, oh, you're a consultant, or, oh, and I'm like, there's lots of Indigenous consultants. I don't understand how people think these things, but I think it's a set of assumptions that is so deep-seated in Canada, right? And so I think some of the other biases that kind of come into that are the sort of either or spectrum on either Indigenous people are either all good, like we're all doing ceremony and we're all like healing and doing all this stuff, or we're experiencing homelessness and we're self-medicating through addictions and it's sort of like this, right? I mean, in my experience, that's just what I've seen. I know there's probably lots of people who do see that in between, but too often it's that either or, right? And so I'm working on some fiction right now, and I really want my characters to show that, yeah, actually we're just human, right? Like the people who are healing, and I'll get there because the next question Manisha has for me is, what are your current struggles? How much time have you got? So, we can be, thank you, amazing people, just like everyone sharing the space today. But we still have things, right? And we're all flawed. Every single human is flawed. And as I just said, folks who might be, engaging in gang activity or something, or extremely antisocial things, if you talk to them one-on-one, as probably many of you have, given your work, they can really contribute amazing things, right? So it's that, I think there's a lot of unconscious assumptions that are happening here. So, yeah. So I said I get to current struggles, not that this is therapy time, and I am mindful of time, because there's a resource list I want to share at the end here, around, helping youth, maybe connect more with culture. So I'll wrap up Manisha's questions here now, and say current struggles. And I know, because of talking with friends and colleagues in the community, lack of family support. That is huge for so many of us. And yeah, I'm 55 years old, and I know that people in their 20s look to me, and I'm happy to be a baby older person just learning how to, do that, have that reciprocal relationship and to guide youth. But, even at 55, it'd be nice to have a sister or brother or whatever, but my family were all completely estranged. It was not a good scene in my household. We had every single one of the aces, like I'm serious, every single one. And I do have chosen family. And that, of course, is why I'm joyful and I feel supported and all of the rest of it. But I think I would bring that up as a number one, because that is the case for so many Indigenous people. I have a colleague that I worked with, and just before I left Toronto in 19, I was so happy to see her on a streetcar, Bathurst streetcar. And I said, hey, it's so good to see you. I want to tell you I'm moving, and I didn't have your email and la, la, la. And she said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I just had a book come out, da, da, da. And we got to talking, right? Because long streetcar rides in Toronto traffic. And she said something, about, yeah, that's the same in my family, like, residential schools. And then, some of us were in foster care. And, I have a lot of brothers and sisters, but we're not really close. And I just nodded. Yeah, I hear you. It is so much the case. Now, there are wonderful intact families too, of course, both end. But I think for so many of us, the lack of family support is a struggle. It can be a challenge to wonder, well, I know I have this friend. Could I ever call them at 3 a.m.? Who do you put as your emergency contact? You know what I mean? Like, these are real things. Now, I don't think necessarily that Indigenous people face this next thing that I want to address more so than other people necessarily, but again, I think there is an Indigenous context, seeing as though at least half of Canada is unceded territory. I really lack secure housing. You know, I've been a lifelong renter. And sure, I'm a good tenant. Landlords like me. I'm professional. I have good whatevers that they want, right? But like I've been rent evicted several times because people want to raise rent or, and it's that lack of security. And I think, well, I'll never be able with, writing books in Canada, and, being a self-employed consultant, to, and an editor, to really afford my own home. So what, am I going to be 75 and still being rent evicted? Don't look forward to that. So secure housing is an issue, but that's the same for everyone. But then I think in the Indigenous context, when this is like literally our land, how is that happening? We have to have this conversation. Yeah. Current struggles, I would also say, small cough, sorry, is that, I was so lucky in the 90s to have guidance from elders and knowledge keepers through the agencies, Anishinaabe Health, different places where I worked. But now I think today current struggles would be a feeling that there's somewhat a lack of community. Like I definitely have friends in Vancouver, Indigenous community, like people that I know and work contacts and people that were in touch, and like there's a sense of community. So I shouldn't say lack of community. I have a community, but I feel like that most of the agencies in, towns and cities are very much around social service oriented, and that they're really geared toward, as they should be, because we need this and we need more of them, people who are experiencing, homelessness and need childcare help and like the rest of it, right? We need that. And there was was it about 10, 50, oh gosh, was it 15 years ago now, 10 years ago? I don't even remember. There was a bunch of social service agencies in Toronto came together and just for a one-time report. And they released this report on, the state of Toronto social service agencies. And one of the biggest findings they found, even back then, was the same thing I'm talking about now, which is that the agencies are geared to, survival and like services to folks who need like intervention right now, or support right now. And, where are people who, maybe have jobs or families and are sort of at a different place in their lives, to gather. Like there's no sort of central gathering space for those of us in urban or rural locations, right? And I don't know if I have a solution to that. Sometimes I think post-secondary institutions can play that for their students, can play that role, with having, institutional powwows and stuff. But for those of us who are maybe even older and working, it's like there's no central sort of place where you can like meet new people and celebrate certain things together, right? So I added a question to Manisha's questions because she had like current struggles, and I thought, well, I want to talk about current successes too. So I added that one in. Health. I think if through the help of Anishinaabe Health, plant medicine, and then later in life, over the last 10, 15 years, accessing traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine from South Asia, a lot of holistic systems, culture-based systems. And I was really happy to hear Rita Cutknife talk about how everyone is Indigenous to somewhere, because, Indigenous science and medicine, I see those same concepts in TCM and in Ayurveda, right? Because it is land-based. Yeah, so I love that comment that she made when I just signed in there. It was like, oh, good time to hear that. I've regained my health through practicing all of that. And I've regained a sense of joy, because I wasn't there really, 20s, 30s, kind of, there was a couple decades when I was in the wilderness. Having books out that the community thinks are relevant and that speak to the issues, and that I haven't taken too many, I hope, missteps in the content, especially as it relates to culture. I'm happy to be able to contribute to community now in that way. But I had to regain my health and a sense of joyfulness first, right? So the last couple questions, and then I'll get to the resource list, and I don't mind opening it up for Q&A as well through the chat. Manisha says, the question is, what is your identity? Well, again, how long have you got? I generally identify as Nehio, but I also want to make clear that I'm mixed, right? And the two for me shouldn't be apart. I don't like this idea of feeling like I'm pulled in different directions. They're all me and I'm here. So I usually say I'm Nehio of mixed Indigenous and European heritage. So that's usually like in a meeting, how I would identify. I mean, I am Scottish, and as I said, I grew up, my grandma Thelma did not want to talk about her Passamaquoddy father, because one side of my family comes from New Brunswick and Maine and relocated to Vancouver. So, you know, and so we mostly grew up Scottish, and through my father's mother is Russian. So I do have a sense of kinship with the Slavic people that I've met. I had a long-term relationship with a Slovak person, so Southern Slav, and I got you know, I talked a lot with their family around Slavic culture, and yes, Rita is correct. Everybody is Indigenous to somewhere. A lot of the values and the daily practices of, you know, land-based cultures in Europe are the same as ours. I wish everybody could return to them, right? But I can't deny growing up in Sagatawa and the effect that that land had on me. And just the effect of, you know, being young and being at the Friendship Center and hearing Cree spoken, you know, that sound. I am in no way fluent. I have about 15 words of Cree, right? But, you know, I can recognize that language, and it just feels like a warm hug every time I hear Cree, right? So, yeah, I am Nehio, but I'm mixed. So I don't know, that seems to confuse some people, but it doesn't confuse me, at least not anymore. So Manisha says, please tell us about your books, especially youth and children. So I think I'll do that through the resource list. But what I wanted to say, because they're not on the resource list yet, because they're not published yet, is that I'm working on 2 new books. So Killing the Witigo just came out. Its birthday was in June. So that's new this year. But I'm working on a book for the middle grades. And it's part of a new Scholastic Canada graphic series on social justice issues. And each book is written by a person from a racialized or marginalized culture. So, and I don't know any of the other authors yet. We haven't been on a big call yet, or what their subjects are. But my subject, mine will be book 2 in the series. They're coming out, they're starting next year. So book 1, I'm not sure when it's coming out. I think maybe spring 24 or summer 24. And then my book will be number 2, and it's all on the issue of clean water from the Indigenous context. And I'm going to guess then that that will be fall of next year. And so just getting these ideas out, right, about what are some, because you can't possibly represent everyone, right, or every culture, every community. It is impossible. But, you know, what are some ideas on water from Indigenous cultural perspectives? And what about the issues about clean water? And when we talk about clean water, I'm widening the book to talk about, you know, here in BC, especially on Van Island, you know, when rivers dry up, what happens to the salmon run, and what does that do to the people? And so, yeah. And then Kids Can Press, I'm working on something. I don't know if any of you know or have seen, I think they came out, I don't know, 5, maybe 7 years ago, something like that. Canadian Geographic had a series of atlases, Indigenous atlases. So one was First Nations, one was Métis, one was Inuit, and then there was like a general volume, and they were heavily like map based. So we're doing a middle grade version of like an Indigenous Atlas of Canada, and that will be out in 2026. So yeah, just in that book trying to get the middle grade readers, you know, grades 4 to, you know, 6-ish, I guess, 7-ish, to think about what is a map and how do we make maps? Who makes maps? Would two people draw a map the same way, right? And then thinking about Canada and Indigenous lives, what are the maps we need today? What are the different types of maps? So it's kind of a complex subject, but we're gonna, you know, make it work for middle grades. Okay, so let me go. I love sharing screen. Let me do this. Share screen, and where is it? I have my entire screen here and not the document I want. Let me open up the document and see if that helps, because it's a PDF resource list. And actually, I will email this to Manisha so that she can send it all out to you, right? Okay, it's not coming up, so y'all are just gonna have to look at my messy desktop for a minute. Sorry, and then we'll do that. Does that work for you? Are you just seeing the resources list? I hope, and not my messy desktop. So I've got a bunch of different books here, and I did concentrate on books because there's a lot of stuff like videos and podcasts and different things. And when I thought about them, the ones that I was aware of, they all more or less seem made for adults, more or less. And I thought, and you know, my thing is books anyway. So, and I won't spend too much time on this, but just to get you situated and why I chose some of this. The first one is actually, and don't be afraid, the first book, Aboriginal Beliefs, Values, and Aspirations, is actually a grade 11 textbook. So, of course, it'll work for young adults, but here, that's what it is. I was part of the author team on this, but when I presented at, I think it was Ontario Library Association, we had one year, I think it was way back like 2013 or something now, it was a good 10 years ago, because this book is about 10 years old, but trust me, it's not dated because we wrote it deliberately so that it would last, right? We had like, there was a whole bunch of us, there was like a focus that year, or one of the themes was on Indigenous libraries and the Indigenous sections in urban and rural libraries, right? And the type of programming that you could do to get Indigenous clients or users into the library, make a difference in families, you know, all of that stuff. So I had in my session a bunch of Indigenous librarians come up to me, and one, you know, and we're just talking after the session as we are wanted to do. And one of the librarians said, and then another one said, yeah, that's happening in my library too. I was so glad to hear it. They said that even though this is like a grade 11 textbook, that they thought, hardly anybody's really going to take this out. What was happening is that kids of all ages, young adults, people in their 20s, and even elders were taking out this book and reading it like a nonfiction book. Awesome. Because that's what you want to hear, is that there's a textbook that can be used in schools, but it's not too textbooky, right? And there's a lot of cultural stuff in here, right? So, and we have sections here like Voices of the People, right? Where we interviewed community members of all shapes and stripes and, you know, work in the community. And it's just a really good book. I use it to this day to inform basically everything I do. I go back and I go, so what did we say about this? And then I start there, and then I add on, you know, new information and stuff. So, and it is still available from, it was a co-publication between Pearson Canada, a textbook publisher, and Good Minds, which is an Indigenous owned publisher and bookseller in, they're located on Six Nations of the Grand Unceded Territory in Toronto. in Toronto, in Ontario. So it's still available through Good Minds. Probably some of you, because you're Alberta based, have, you're aware of Patty Levican Benson's work. I still think The Outside Circle is a really good book to get conversations going. And it's not specifically like a culture book, but it is, right? Because again, culture is everything. And so, and there's times in The Outside Circle, I'm pointing to my bookcase here. There's times in The Outside Circle where they work through things, or they work through an understanding of things that is a very culture-based approach, even though it's not like bells and whistles, feathers identified as such. It's just the way that those characters are thinking and getting through life that is, culture-based. Gord Hill, he's a Hill, so he should be Mohawk. I'm not sure if he's Six Nations. I think so. 500 Years of Resistance comic book. That is a great book because it's history, but it's cool, right? Because it's comics. And I find, this is the thing, right? That, you can't sort of force kids to sort of, we're going to do culture now. Like I found in my classroom experience, because I taught in public schools for about 5 years between 2007 and 2012 before I started consulting and writing books. And I found that if I located, culture and cultural ideas in like something that made sense to them, right? So if we're talking about a struggle that we're having today as Indigenous peoples, then I could say, well, that actually relates to what happened in, name a date, and then give them a book like 500 Years of Resistance. And then they start seeing Indigenous peoples as people with agency, right? As people who have always responded and resisted, the various aspects of colonization and continuing colonialism. And then to widen it out from that into how does this impact your lives today, right? And then that becomes sort of the impetus to like, oh, well, maybe I could talk to someone about that. Or maybe I could, go to that, naming something off the top of my head, like theater festival, Indigenous theater festival, and learn more about that subject. Oh yeah, they're having a play on that, exactly. So not to say here's a culture thing that we're going to do with you right now necessarily, but to get them involved in thinking about history and experiences and perspectives, and get to culture through that, right? I don't like this title. I don't know why they had to use the I word. I don't like the I word, but this is what it's called: Dreaming in Indian, Contemporary Native American Voices. And I suppose it's because they were going for a cross-border thing too. They wanted to sell this book in the States, and they do still use Native American and Indian, unfortunately. Indigenous is becoming more common down in the States, but yeah. It's a really good book because it's the voices of, right? It's Indigenous people who have, life experiences to share. And, it's a really chunky book. So it's not like just a sea of text. It's a lot of different like boxes and different, the artwork and the graphics make it really appealing. A lot of my students really liked that book. I had that one in my classroom library. You guys have probably heard of Jason Eaglespeaker's work, right? So on education, there's the PG version, but I still use the original version because I think we're at a place now where we really have to talk about exactly what happened, and we can't be freaked out that, there's some horrible stuff there. I think we do have to, prepare folks, and to make sure that, if you hand someone this book that, you say, there can be some stuff, there might be some stuff in here, and, there's that one chapter that I've read it ahead for you. And, that one chapter, you might want to be with someone who can support you when you read that chapter. So offer support, but I wouldn't avoid the issues. And through that, again, talk about culture, because what are we doing today to address residential schools? And what are we doing, with the suspected unmarked graves? And what are the cultural celebrations and ceremonies that have taken place? And then it opens up this whole sort of thing where then they can become interested in that. I've included the Alberta Elders Cree Dictionary because I think that language can often be a bit of a gateway drug, if I can use it in that way, to becoming interested in culture. Like, understanding Cree is sort of like my favorite example from the dictionary is that, and I know that dialects change and shift throughout the province, never mind throughout the country. But one example that's in the book that I always remember is that the word for kettle is really can be translated as duck pail, right? Because of the neck, and it's a pail, right? I love that about Cree. So, and I don't know Cree, so if I'm a little bit wrong on that, please feel free to correct me. That's how I remember it, the story from the dictionary. And so getting kids involved in what does that tell you about how Cree people think, right? And getting them sort of like, oh yeah, I don't know, man. And so, and I've included my own books here because I know Manisha would kill me if I didn't. But also because I've had letters and messages on the socials from young people who are actually reading a big thick book like Legacy. It's like thick. And I didn't think a lot of young people would be attracted to it, but I tried to do everything through the lens of Indigenous thought, Indigenous philosophy, because I didn't want to use just the research papers and, talking about the DSM and like, nah. This is from an Indigenous context around what do we think trauma is, and talking about it through the lens of the quantum universe and some politics too. So I tried to make Legacy and then also Killing the Wittigo very culture-based. And I know, and this one of course is a YA book, so this one is made for kids. And this one is chunky as well, sort of like the Dreaming book, because I didn't want it to be too like you had to start at the beginning and read to the end and a sea of text, because a lot of kids are not attracted to that. So like there's pages like this, right, where there's a big chunk of information, another kind of chunk that's related, and then some quotations, because I spoke to several young people to make this book, because young kids don't like. In Legacy I use examples from my own life and my family's life. Oh Lord, for a YA book, kids don't care about me, I'm old, right? So I wanted them to hear from their peers, right? So yeah, and I tried to make that, and my two expert readers, like I said, especially check, where you think I'm going with the culture-based models. So, and of course they don't speak for everyone, but I tried to make sure that it was usable and relevant and respectful, but also, a little bit like I wanted to attract younger people to thinking about, cultural values and cultural practices. So in both of those. Now, the last few books on the list, starting with a Coyote Columbus story, are more for younger readers. Although a Coyote Columbus story, I know some high school kids that really like that book and who actually did a play on it in a program I was working in once. So it's a few years old now, but it talks a lot about colonization, and also because Kent Monkman did the art, the main character, Coyote or Coyote, is a two-spirit, but it's never actually addressed. It's only in the pictures, where sometimes in sneakers with a baseball bat and sometimes with lipstick and a fancy hairdo, and it's that sort of trickster being able to be different things at different times, right? So it's very culture-based in terms of Kent's art, for sure. Larry Loyi, As Long as the Rivers Flow, I still love that book. You know, I know there's been other books published and there's been other memoirs, but I find a lot of the newer memoirs don't really get into cultural practices. And in this book, As Long as the Rivers Flow, you know, Larry talks about, you know, his kokum telling him that, oh, when you hear the owl sound, you know, you should pay attention because, you know, so there's a lot of cultural material in As Long as the Rivers Flow. Now, you've noticed that I've put like the publishers in terms of the URLs here, but I couldn't on this next one because I don't know why. Anic Press, the Ball Players and Bone Setters book is unfortunately out of print, but it is still available used on AbeBooks, and there's still lots of copies for sale at the evil Amazon. So, and it's a really great book that I've used with younger kids really up until grade 6 or 7, because, and even though it's based in Central and South America, well, mostly Central, Aztec and Maya, it really gets them thinking about how Indigenous societies were, you know, in terms of governance and, you know, infrastructure, every bit as sophisticated as European societies, right? We had garbage collectors, we had, you know, everything, right? We had, you know, dancers, we had priests, we had this, we had that. And also it's a little bit gross in what they talk about in some of the jobs, which a lot of boys like, right? So, yeah. And then the last two are linked. They're both from Anic Press. A Native American thought of it and an Inuit thought of it. That's actually bad grammar. It should be an Inuk thought of it. You know, singular. But for young kids, the idea, I mean, it's, you know, it's about inventions and innovations. So it is what it is. But it is mostly material culture, but it is very, very good because there's still so much shame in our communities. And I'm going to name it, even if other people sometimes don't want to. There is so much shame in our communities. I lived it myself around feeling ashamed about, well, now that I know what we are, I'm not going to tell anybody. Right? I'll just pretend I'm white. I did that in undergraduate school for a couple of years until all the other Native kid students started outing me. Thank you. And I can laugh now, but at the time it was incredibly painful and confusing, right? We still, part of lateral violence is that we still shame each other because we've been shamed by the dominant society. We've learned that, we've normalized it, and now we shame each other. And I think when I think back to my work with elementary school students from K to 8, I also, you know, worked with secondary students, but in the classroom setting, it was K to 8. And they would come to me just in the depths of thinking, I am worthless. I heard that and I saw it, and I saw and heard it like exhibited to me, even if the word wasn't used, so many times. And a book like this, like, look at this, look at all this amazing stuff that we use today that is actually from the Indigenous world and wouldn't exist except the Europeans came here and learned about these things too. That can literally change a kid's life. And to be able to then think to themselves, well, I want to learn more, right? So again, books are gateway drugs. So I'll stop the share and I'll send that, the list. Those links are live. It's a PDF document. I'll send that to Manisha. And is that it? I think we have like all of 4 minutes for a Q&A or something. If you're interested, I can open the chat in case there's anything coming in. And I know you're doing a multi-day training. So I know too that when we're involved in these things that sometimes it can be a lot. So it's okay if you don't have any questions. And I know you all have emails zooming in on you and, you know, work, you know, other work still to do. So I think I'll stop there, Manisha. And then, but do let me know. You can put up your hand or in the chat if you have any questions. I'll take a sip of water. That was a lot.
Thank you, Susan. What a pleasure always it is to listen to you. It